Hello, Year 12. Welcome to your first online lesson with me. I hope you all had a really nice Christmas and that you feel sufficiently relaxed and ready to work really hard this term. I'm really sad that I don't get to see you face to face, but this is the new norm now for a little while, unfortunately. So we'll try and make the most of it and still have a great time learning. You will see me live once a week starting next week. So we've got that to look forward to. So what I expect from you for this lesson and for every lesson is I want you to try and find a quiet spot, and I know that's not always easy, but try your best. And I want you to have with you your textbook, obviously pen and paper. I want you to just listen to the video, watch the PowerPoint as I talk you through it, write up your notes as you normally would in lesson, and you can pause me at any time if I'm going too fast. And please email me or post any questions on Teams if you have any questions about anything. And then I want you to upload notes onto Teams at the end of every lesson. And I want you to do this on the day that it's set. And I will be checking. So please try and keep up. I know it's not easy, and I know online learning is really hard and you're all going through a lot and it's a tough time. But it will be worth it in the end if you keep up. It will cause you more stress if you aren't able to keep up. So if you're struggling, please come and talk to me. So today we're carrying on with research methods. But the good news is that before February half term we will have finished all of year 1 and all of year 2 research methods, so you'll never have another research methods lesson ever again apart from revision. So that's good news. So I want you to have a go at this starter. Latrinalia refers to graffiti in toilets, and I want you to think of the graffiti that you've seen throughout your life. What have you seen written as graffiti? Or maybe if you have been a little bit naughty, maybe when you were younger, maybe you wrote your own graffiti. Try and think of what you wrote. And do you think there's a difference between graffiti in the girls' toilets compared to the boys' toilets? So I want you to pause me now and just try and make a list of things that you've seen written. So interestingly, this was actually a study done by someone called James Green in 2003. So have a look at your list. And to be honest, I wish I could hear the list because I'm sure you've got some pretty funny ones. But when we collect qualitative data, which this is, it's descriptive data, it's not quantitative, it's not numerical. When we collate this, then we want it to be scientific, and if we want it to be scientific, we need it to be systematic and objective. And this is where content and thematic analysis is. So I want you to write these definitions. Content analysis, which we have done, if you remember the Power Rangers lesson, we looked at content analysis there. We're going to look at it in a little bit more detail today. It's a kind of observational study in which behaviour is usually observed indirectly in visual, written or verbal material. It may involve either qualitative or quantitative analysis. So content analysis could be anything. You could be analysing films, books, children playing to see if they're aggressive, anything. And then we have thematic analysis, which is a technique just for qualitative data. So whereas content analysis is for quantitative and qualitative, thematic is only qualitative data. So from the name you might be able to guess that it's where we look for themes, and how we look for themes is we look for categories. And we have talked about behavioural categories before when we've talked about observations. So we identify these behavioural categories and then we organise the data according to these themes. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a little while. So James Green conducted the writing on the stall experiment, and he used a thematic analysis to compare male and female graffiti. What kind of experiment would this be? So firstly, what kind of experiments are there? There is a lab experiment, a field experiment, natural or quasi. So what do you think this is? Pause me if you need time to think about it. It would be a quasi experiment. Why, I hear you ask? Because he's looking at the difference between male and female. And now, remember, natural and quasi are both experiments where the researcher doesn't manipulate the ivy, but in a natural experiment, someone has manipulated it at some point, whereas in a quasi, it's a natural thing that occurs in us. So age would also be a quasi experiment. Gender is a quasi experiment because nobody has manipulated that. How would we categorise the examples of graffiti that you have come up with? So have a look at the list that you've written. What kind of things are in there? I imagine some of them are funny. You might have a humour category. I imagine maybe some of them are insulting. So just have a look at the list that you've written and try and come up with just a few categories, and then try and put them in those categories. So the writings on the store by James Green. He looked at 723 inscriptions from 189 female toilets, 268 male toilets, and 266 study booths to provide a mixed gender comparison. By the way, you don't need to write this down, you don't need to know the study, this is just so you get an idea of what a thematic analysis is. So the sample was analysed and it produced the following categories. So sex discussions, sex requests, sex descriptions, homosexuality, rape discussions, politics, tax student fees, personal advice. I'm not going to read them all, but basically those are the categories that James Green came up with. You might have had some of those, you might not have had. I don't imagine any of you wrote about tax, student fees or debt, but that's what he found in the toilets. Anyway, the data was categorised and a second individual independently coded 25% of the data to check for reliability. Remember, when we talk about reliability, we're talking about consistency. And they came up with 89.7% agreement between coders, which means that the second independent coder who looked at the graffiti that James had looked at agreed with the categories 89.7% of the time, which is very, very good agreement. So that implies that there is high inter-rater reliability there. Conclusion, the graffiti from the female toilets tended to be more polite and interactive, whereas those in the male toilets were more argumentative and negative. The only sexist remarks were found in the mixed gender context. Okay, so today's lesson we're going to look at content analysis, which I've explained is a kind of observational study, and we usually observe this behaviour indirectly, so books, diaries, TV programmes. And then we're going to look at thematic analysis, which is the same pretty much, but there's more emphasis on developing themes from the data that we collect. So content analysis can have a similar procedure to any observational study, but instead of observing people, a researcher usually makes observations indirectly through books, films, adverts, and so on. So we're going to look at 3 things to do with content analysis. First is the sampling method that we look at. 2 is coding the data. And 3 is method or representing the data. So number 1, sampling method. I want you to try and think, what are the 2 types of sampling techniques in an observation? And this is one where students tend to get mixed up because as soon as they see the word sampling, they think volunteer, opportunity, stratified, etc. Whereas with observation, if we're looking at sampling, we're looking at 2 other things. So I want you to try and think of what those 2 are. Pause me if you need time to think. They are time and event sampling. So time sampling is where you only observe behaviour, write down behaviour at given intervals. So you might, if you're looking at aggression in a playground, for example, there might be too much to look at. So what you do is you look up every 30 seconds, record everything that's going on, and then wait another 30 seconds and then record everything that's going on. Whereas event sampling is where you record absolutely everything that occurs. And that's useful for when maybe something doesn't occur very often. So if looking at the content of books, do you look at every page or say every 5th page? So that would be a type of time sampling if we're looking at every 5th page. That would be time sampling rather than event. If analysing the adverts on TV, does the research sample behaviours, e.g. every 30 seconds, which is time sampling, or note down when certain behaviours occur, which would be event sampling? If comparing the content in books, does the researcher select books randomly or identify certain characteristics, e.g. choose biographies or romantic fiction? So these are all things that we need to consider when we're looking at a content analysis. Number 2 is we need to think about coding the data. So the aim of content analysis is to be able to draw conclusions. We want to look at a piece of data, quantitative or qualitative, and we want to say, okay, what is this telling us about human behaviour? So therefore we need these behavioural categories. The researcher needs to create a list of categories they are going to look for and then count the instances the behaviours are seen. So when we did the Power Rangers video, we categorised aggression into punching, kicking, I remember I think Tabby said cartwheels. So if you remember back, we had lots of behavioural categories and then we just quantified how many times each of those happened. Decisions about behavioural categories may involve a thematic analysis. Create behavioural categories after completing a thematic analysis first. So sometimes we look at the themes first and then create the behavioural categories from them. Which behavioural categories would you use if we were investigating aggression shown by children in a playground? I want you to just pause me and think about what sort of things would demonstrate aggression by children. So just pause me, think about it. So it would be things like maybe shouting, insults, throwing things, kicking, punching. Those might be the behavioural categories that you've come up with. What about use of horror language in a book? Have a think about that. This could be things like use of pathetic fallacy. Those of you who study English probably have come up with some really good ideas. It could be dark metaphors. It could be the use of like a description of, I don't know, like a horrible thing happening. I don't know, I don't want to get too dark. What about this one? Flirting on a first date at a restaurant. What sort of behavioural categories would you have here? I think we spoke about this in lesson once. So it would be things like eye contact, laughing, playing with your hair, playing with your earrings, that sort of thing. Next one is the conversations of football fans at a game. What sort of behavioural categories could we look for here? We could look at negative language against the other team. We could look at insults. We could look at, positive language like celebration, etc. Okay, so that's content analysis. And then thirdly, for content analysis, we need to look at the method of representing the data. Data can be recorded in behaviour categories in 2 different ways. One is the one that we did with the Power Rangers, where we count the instances of each category that you've used, and this is quantitative content analysis, because we literally just tallied every time a behaviour happened. Or you can describe the examples in each category, and this is qualitative content analysis. So, for example, if you were going to do a content analysis of your favourite song, for example, you could pick out direct lyrics of the songs and put them into each category rather than quantifying them, if that makes sense. Okay, so now we move on to thematic analysis. Thematic analysis has some steps that you need to follow in order to identify these themes of whatever you're looking at. And remember that with thematic analysis, it's only qualitative data that we'll look at. So it might be a song, it might be a book, it might be conversations, transcripts. Okay, so number 1 is we read and reread the data's transcript dispassionately, or do the same with the video, trying to understand the meaning communicated and the perspective of participants. No notes should be made. So, for example, if we're looking at, sorry, I always go back to this example, the aggression in children in a playground, we might have a transcript from that. We might have written down everything that the children were saying. So we read and reread the data transcript just to get really familiar with it. So I want you to think about how we would do this first step with the graffiti example that we spoke about in the starter. So how would we do step number 1? Pause me if you need time to think. Basically, we would study the photograph or the written record of the wide range of graffiti. So we might have a picture of the graffiti in the stalls, and we just look at it over and over and over again, and we just reread it. Okay. Step number 2 is we break the data into meaningful units. So what we mean by units is just small bits of text which are independently able to convey meaning. This might be equivalent to sentences or phrases. So with the song, we might, if it's like a romantic song, I can't think of any songs right now, my mind's gone completely blank, but if we're looking at the themes of a romantic song, then you might pick out words like I love you, or I miss you, or I don't know, my mind's gone really blank, but you get the idea. So how would we do number 2 for the graffiti example? We would literally just write down each item of graffiti. So we might write down I was here 2K21, or I heart school. I don't know, I really don't know what people graffiti these days, but that's what you do, you just write it down. And then what we do is we assign a label or a code to each unit, and these codes or labels are the initial categories that we're going to be using. So because we've read and reread the transcript or looked at the photo, we have some idea of the themes that are developing by now. So with the graffiti example, each unit that we've written down, each example of the graffiti, is given a code to describe it. So we might have humour, we might have advice, we might have love, or we might have power domination. And these are the initial codes, the initial categories. Number 4 is we combine the simple codes into larger categories, themes, and then instances can be counted or examples provided. So we might have a larger category of just positive or negative graffiti, because some graffiti is positive, and then some of it can be quite horrible and insulting and sexist and racist, etc. So larger order categories are developed which combine units such as interpersonal concerns, or like I just said, you might want to make it positive and negative. And then number 5 is we check the categories that we've come up with, and how we do this is we collect a new data set. So we look at a whole new picture of a different toilet for the graffiti, and if our categories are good, if we've done a good thematic analysis, then they should fit the new data. We should be able to categorize them in the same way, and that means that you've done a good thematic analysis. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I want you to take a minute now, and it might seem stupid, you might feel silly pausing the video to have a think, but this is the way that you'll learn the most, when you're able to recall from your own memory the information that we've learned in the past. So pause and try and think of some strengths and weaknesses of content analysis. Even if you only think of one, it's better than none. And then we'll go through them once you unpause me. So, 3 strengths. Number 1 is that quantitative data is very quick, or can be quick and easy, to show clear patterns in the data. Descriptive statistics, e.g. the mean, can be used and conclusions easily drawn. So content analysis is very useful to have this quick quantitative data analysis. When sources are retained, then the content analysis can be replicated and the observations can be tested for reliability. We can test inter-observer reliability. And this is really important, because if we have inter-observer reliability, it means that our results are consistent. So with thematic analysis, it means that our themes are consistent. Or if you're testing multiple, maybe you're doing a content or a thematic analysis of a certain author. If you have inter-observer reliability, it means that you and someone else have found the same themes across the different books. And number 3, it's more ecologically valid as it is based on observing what someone is doing. Real communication is current and relevant. So you could say that it has high mundane realism also, because we're not studying people in a lab. We are literally just measuring or collecting what they've already done, and nobody's forced them to do it. So there's no demand characteristics, there's no researcher bias. It is more ecologically valid. Okay, and now weaknesses. Observer bias reduces the objectivity and validity of the findings because different observers may interpret the meaning of behavioural categories differently. So you might have a pre-written schema that children are lovely, so you might not see certain things that children do as aggressive, whereas someone else might. And you can't help but bring your bias when you're an observer, because you can't help your past experiences. Just as you might see something as aggressive, whereas another observer might not. So that reduces the validity because we might not actually be measuring what we intended to measure. It can also be culture biased because interpretation of verbal or written content will be affected by the language and culture of the observer and the behavioural categories used. Like, you guys use really cool language that I have no idea what it means. So I might interpret something that you say completely different because I have no idea what the word means because I'm old. So yes, it's culturally biased. And then the last weakness is that qualitative data analysis, so thematic analysis, is very time consuming to complete. It is more valid, but it's so time consuming because you have to read and reread the data, and then you have to come up with the units, and then you have to make sure that the units are good. It's a very time consuming process, so that's a weakness. And this concludes your first online lesson. And let me know, please, if you have any questions. Please either post them on Teams or email me, and upload your notes, please, onto Teams as soon as you're able to. I'll be chasing you up if you don't, so please do that. It's really important to try and keep up. I hope you have a lovely day, and I will speak to you soon. Bye.